Um, Dr. Scarbrough is with us today discussing pop culture, apologetics, and the use of stories as dialogue. Dr. Scarbrough has a number of degrees, including theological studies, Christian apologetics, and a PhD in music with an emphasis on philosophy. Dr. Scarbrough is a professor of philosophy at Pasco Hernando State College, just up the road in Tampa. He is the lead editor of the work Disney as a Doorway to Apologetic Dialogue, as well as an editor of Disney and the Moral Imagination. That is a 2-in-1 book that we actually have over for sale at the book table. That there are signed copies there as well that you can pick up there. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scarbrough.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. As you mentioned, I want to talk to you about pop culture, apologetics, how these things come together. So let's just dive in. Look at this image. Just the image. You may recognize the story. I don't want to talk about stories today, but just look at the image. What do you see? Can you think of any theological issues or moral questions related just to what you see taking place in the image? Maybe loss, grief, lament, problem of pain and evil, questions of hope in the human condition. Now, if you recognize it, consider the story which comes to mind when you view the image. This is from Snowdrop. We're more familiar with it as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, what moral or theological issues or questions might come to mind in light of a greater narrative? The story of the curse, maybe of loss and redemption, beauty, evil, pride, greed and jealousy, friendship, loyalty. What about this image? The shedding of a beastly skin to find a human being inside. You might ponder the question, what role does beauty play in the beast's salvation? In this session, I want to unpack pop culture and consider why it's a powerful tool in the hands of the Christian apologist. After considering different approaches to culture and whether some are healthier or more harmful than others, we will consider connections between imagination, ethics, faith, between worldview and the stories we share, and also the power of the arts to expose deeper convictions and to suggest new ways in which we might imagine them together. Now, I have an advantage here because you've already been thinking about some of these things. I'm very pleased if you were at Dr. Bullock's breakout last night. And of course, our introductory keynote, we started thinking about the imaginary, so that's great. If you have attended those sessions, I'm going to be unpacking some more of that. Now, before we consider effective ways to engage in culture, we should first consider different ways to approach culture and some less effective ways to engage in. So first, there are a number of ways to approach culture and pop culture in general, not even as a Christian, but just how we approach culture. In his book, Hollywood Worldviews, Brian Godawa identifies two extremes when it comes to consuming film, and his analysis expands well beyond film as well. Cultural gluttons are those who they consume culture unthinkingly. They binge on everything and do not even really stop to consider what it is that they're consuming, putting into their minds. Cultural anorexics, on the other hand, are those who refuse to consume any of it, and so they are, so to speak, malnourished, or out of touch with the culture. This can actually hinder the accessibility of your communication with others. Godawa advocates avoiding these extremes and instead approaching culture through the lens of redemption, seeing all stories as attempting to speak to some sense of loss and recovery. Let us call this mean between extremes the cautious consumer with a dietary discretion and a fit wit. Now, and I'm moving quickly, so I apologize if you're trying to capture everything that you see here. There are a number, so that's a couple of ways to approach culture in general, but there are also a number of ways to approach questions of pop culture as it relates to Christianity in particular. Some non-believers may outright reject that theology has anything to do with pop culture, and so they reject its pop culture relevance. Some believers distance themselves, not necessarily to be antithetical, but because pop culture just seems irrelevant to the gospel, or maybe sometimes irreverent. So both of these are forms of separatism, and the latter can actually become a form of cultural anorexia for the Christian. Some theists assume a position of antithesis. Here they're emphasizing God is righteous and rejecting or condemning culture in pretty much all forms as corrupt. Ultimately, though, they might be burning more bridges in the process. In his 1951 book, Christ and Culture, Richard Niebuhr called this paradigm the Christ against culture approach. Christ always stands in opposition to whatever trends are popular. And this can lead to the more extreme form of cultural anorexia. This is a Christian cancel culture approach in all things. Protest movies, music, and the arts, any of them that might be perceived as ungodly simply because they are either explicitly, they're not explicitly Christian, or they're clearly non-Christian. They're secular, so rejected. Alas, because they protest the very things that most people love and long to consume, this can necessarily create division and distance, again, in approaching others. Consider, for example, reactions to heavy metal or Dungeons and Dragons in the 20th century, or reactions to Harry Potter movies and books in the 21st century. If it's Max of the Occult, it's witchcraft and devil worship. Get rid of it. Well, should we get rid of Narnia and Lord of the Rings? Got some occult in there. And some Christians would, in fact, say we should get rid of it. Since the 1970s, some have attacked Disney films as replacing God with magic and individualism, and for an overall lack of Christian reference. Actually, one of the reasons that Walt Disney distanced himself purposefully from organized religion, even though he still professed belief in God, was because of the abusive influence of his church-going father. Elias Disney wasn't always this way. He used to sneak out to the woods to play music without his mother knowing. But one night she discovered him and smashed his fiddle over his head. You see, the devil's in the fiddle because music leads to dancing, and dancing is evil. Unfortunately, the religious rigidity of Elias's upbringing actually influenced the way that he raised his own boys, Walt and Roy, as well. So some people say all music is the devil. For others, rock and roll is the devil's music. Or maybe rap is Satan's psalter. Or even that old foosball's the devil, if you know the reference. Now, can stereotype shoes fit? Sure. Does this mean necessarily that all S are P? No. And ironically, sometimes the labels that we create often reinforce stereotypes that we encounter. In the history of heavy metal music, for example, the us-them labeling of against the church actually reinforced an identity of otherness that those who enjoyed metal began to embrace. And so it helped to solidify the secular identity stereotype. In fact, there's an underground scene all the time of Christians who enjoyed metal that were kind of rejected by the church, and also now because the culture is being told you're not, you stand against religion, the Christian metalheads also felt, I have no place in my society. So it creates problems. But even if and when a shoe does fit, does this mean there is no common ground and room for dialogue? No. Consider the following lyrics. Could it be you're afraid of what your friends might say if they knew you believed in God above? They should realize before they criticize that God is the only way to love. Now, if you had to guess, to what singer, band, or genre even would you attribute these lyrics? Say it again. You're right. Ozzy Osbourne, controversial figure. When he was with the controversial band Black Sabbath, he wrote these lyrics. Now, Ozzy's on to something. He was on something, if you know anything about that. He was on to something here. And this reminds me of something that Socrates once said. This reminds me of something Socrates once said. Now, Socrates is referring to poets, but it kind of encapsulates all artists. And so I'm paraphrasing. Artists' intuitions are often onto something, yet more often than not, even they are ignorant of just what it is to which they're pointing. So the arts often are profound and point to something profound. The people who give us the gold may not even know it. And in some cases, much of what they give us may be controversial, but that does not mean when they give us the gold, we can't acknowledge it and say, let's talk about that. We can also find a secular culture against Christ approach, seeing religious narratives as manipulative and oppressive and harmful, thereby seeking to expose and exposing to oppose theological transcripts in mainstream media. This may be some within a critical theory approach or some from a perspective of critical social justice. It might be seeing any kind of religious overarching narrative as oppressive and trying to find that to pull out that influence. Avoiding antithesis, some Christians might adopt an approach of synthesis. So emphasizing emphasizing God as love and community as exclusive, though potentially watering down moral and theological truth. Niebuhr called this approach the Christ of culture. On this view, culture is not really in conflict with the gospel. So acknowledging good in culture, this approach attempts to merge culture with the language of Christianity. The potential problem with this approach, however, is that treating Christ and culture as co-equal sometimes can diminish the lordship of Christ and ignore the power of sin to suppress truth. And since we cannot serve two masters and culture tends to put the greater pressure on us, it can ultimately encourage us to give authority to culture rather than to the king. Progressive Christianity would fall into this camp as it tends to stress care, compassion, and inclusivity, but is often criticized for de-emphasizing core aspects of Christian theology, like trading truth for community, so to speak. The remaining approaches all fall under the heading Christ above culture. Broadly speaking, because there's some nuance here, but broadly speaking, this approach embraces a sort of biased dualism. Living between two worlds, one seeks goodness within the culture while his or her allegiance is ultimately to God. Essentially, the idea is this: culture is affected by sin. But since culture, in many ways, is a reflection of the imago Dei, the image of God, in those within culture, and God cares for all of us, we are called to engage culture and to seek transformation and understanding. We're also called to seek the good of the city in which we dwell. Yet, culture is affected by sin. And so there's a dualistic tension where, as Paul and later St. Augustine put it, we are members of a heavenly city and resident aliens in the earthly city, ambassadors of another kingdom. This paradigm synthesizes where appropriate, but without compromising serious moral considerations, and becomes antithetical when necessary, though attempting to build rather than burn dialogical bridges. Yet it generally approaches artistic expression within culture as reflecting a deep goodness in creation. or it presses into worldview assumptions and related value prescriptions in order to foster dialogue, which points us back to Christ ultimately. This, I think, is where an effective cultural apologetics thrives. Now, there's some of you, I don't know your familiarity with the term apologetics even, so what is cultural apologetics? It has not been, the term has been around for a while, but kind of underground. It's becoming more of a subfield of apologetic exploration. In a general sense, cultural apologetics is the use of cultural artifacts and ideas, especially ideas presented through the arts, to encourage apologetic dialogue. I think it's especially helpful here to understand the distinction between evangelism and pre-evangelism. Rather than harvesting, just trying to get someone saved or catch the fruit when it's ready to fall, so to speak, it's best to see a cultural apologetics, maybe other forms of apologetics as well, as primarily a form of gardening, pulling the weeds of bad ideas, tilling the soil of stubborn minds and hardened hearts, and planting seeds of thoughtfulness and wisdom. Francis Schaeffer once wrote, "We must never forget that the first part of the gospel is not accept Christ as Savior, but God is there. Only then is someone ready to hear God's solution to man's moral dilemma." In the words of Palm Beach Atlantic University's own Paul Gould, the apologist, this is in his book, Cultural Apologetics, the cultural apologist works to awaken those within culture to their deep-seated longings for goodness, truth, and beauty, to resurrect relevance by showing that Christianity offers plausible answers to universal human longings, and to resurrect hope. Acts 17 stands out as the biblical model here. Paul says, "I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. You are ignorant of the very thing that you worship." And this is what I'm going to show you, essentially. So Paul uses Greek culture, appealing both to religious practices and to poetic wisdom, as a doorway to dialogue for uncovering deeper truths, theological truths. This is the power of cultural apologetics, engaging culture with culture, uncovering worldview narratives through the arts, teaching deeper truths by reaching longing hearts. Next, if we're going to consider approaching stories in the arts as opportunities for unpacking ideas of faith and worldview, then we should first consider what faith has to do with the imagination. Here's where I'm going to tread back on some of the ground we've covered, maybe it'll help. We've covered last night, since the similar thing. Here we should clarify, though, our meaning of faith. We believe many things about the world, but we do not necessarily act upon all of those beliefs. When we do act according to our convictions, we are wagering our view in light of reality. I have nothing invested in the belief that horses sleep while standing. I have nothing invested in the belief that chickens exist. But when I go to a stoplight and I press my brake, I'm fully invested in the belief that my brake, that is going to cause my car to slow rather than accelerate. Or a more familiar analogy, when I jump from a plane with a parachute, I'm fully invested in the parachute's going to work. Right? So faith, I think, in a more healthy and helpful understanding, whether it's intentional or unconscious, all measures of faith are a wager. Based upon our unexamined ideas about reality, we take a chance anytime we act in light of an implicit, ethical, or eternal question. In this sense, all worldviews, even contrary to what they might say, the non-religious worldview, are exercises in faith. Simply put, faith is conviction, wagering, action. Now, if to some degree imagination plays a role in conviction, then this foundational imagining is terribly significant, and therefore tethered to questions of faith and worldview. Now, the term worldview can make some people uncomfortable. It's understandable. As James Sire, who wrote a book on worldview, points out, there is a fluid nature to worldview, as it is constantly under the pressure of further contemplation, new information, and our daily encounters with problems of evil and suffering, stuff going on in the world, hurricanes. He says, broad strokes both miss the finer points of our individual worldviews and sometimes misrepresent any one person's worldview. This does not, however, mean that worldview as a concept of study is unimportant. Rather, as Dr. Gould has written, worldview analysis is necessary but not sufficient for cultural apologetics. Now, when we act upon a faith according to our background presumption, something unassumed. This is a particular way of imagining the world to be. Philosopher Charles Taylor, I've heard this name, it keeps coming around. Philosopher Charles Taylor called these background assumptions, which we have accepted because they're part of the culture and part of the narratives that have been handed to us. He calls these our social imaginaries. So let's tying back into that term we got last night. We may not all stop to analyze the nature of the world. We may not stop to think about our beliefs about our beliefs. But we do imagine the world to be a certain way. The most important, not important, but the most popular beliefs and popular value transcripts of the cultural moment work themselves into a backdrop of a collective imaginary, and thereby into various seeds of pop culture, influencing our value hierarchies and our presumptions about the world, about the meaning of life, about the nature and the identity of the human being. Regardless of our own beliefs about our beliefs, we carry with us a default way of imagining the world. And with it, we have ideas about what is right and what is good. Or last night, as she was pressing into what the good life looks like. It is this background way of seeing, which is presupposed and I keep pointing behind me, I don't even think about it. It's presupposed and unanalyzed. That is, it's this background way of seeing that is so easily and powerfully shaped by pop culture through our stories and through overt transcripts from the marketplace and media. Thus, worldview analysis is necessary, though not sufficient, for cultural apologetics. Yet, as Taylor suggested, perhaps the question of worldview is less about our propositional beliefs and more about the way the universe is spontaneously imagined and experienced. This is why storytelling and the arts are so powerful, formative. All cultures share stories, and our stories help us to make sense of who we are. Our stories presume, prescribe, and reify certain values and truth assertions about the world and our place in it. In the words of Diogenes Allen and Eric Springstead, to the degree that we share narratives, we share understanding. And to the degree that there is no sharing, there's the same degree of incomprehension. We cast about the narratives that we have in order to make that which we seek to understand come to life. As philosopher Louis Poyman put it, a good story awakens our imagination to new possibilities and compels us to rethink and revise our everyday assumptions. Yet the most powerful stories, as George McDowell put it, if you're familiar with that name, this is an influence on Lewis for sure, I think Tolkien as well. The most powerful stories are not necessarily those that give us things to think about, but those that wake up something in us already. Stories often capitalize on a deep desire within us, an often unspoken conviction about the way the world is or ought to be, a desire for answers concerning identity, meaning, community, the good life, the cessation of suffering, anxiety, estrangement, etc. Pop culture contains many of the narratives we share, and we naturally use some of those narratives to understand ourselves and our world, and we draw its water from more than one well of influence. This means our identities are intertwined with various moral and theological transcripts. For pop culture is replete with narratives that tell us who we are and what we should love and how we should act. Here we can understand the power of using stories for apologetics. As Alistair McGrath put it, Christians must engage the dominant stories of our culture, either by telling a better story that shows these stories are inadequate or incoherent, or through subversive storytelling, in which they enter into a rival cultural narrative and retell its story in light of the Christian worldview. We are called to out-narrate the dominant stories that shape our culture by exposing their weaknesses or showing how they are enfolded by our own, or how they are eclipsed by a more luminous and compelling story. Despite worldview differences, the stories we tell often resonate with echoes of a deeper truth, which we all intuit. If the Christian story of reality is true, then it will naturally encompass shards of truth and gems of wisdom to be found in the other stories that human beings feel compelled to tell. Now, we need to understand that storytelling happens on a number of levels. From actual literary objects and film to music to nonverbal forms of art like dance, even to advertising in the marketplace. Ba-dum-bum-bum-bum. Some of you know that. You got a story, right? All right. That's just the way marketing reaches us, right? It gives us something, and we've got whether the musical idea, the image. Now we're hearing a story with us. Culture involves numerous forms of imaginative transcripts, and it is the cultural apologist's task to engage some of these stories we share. This aspect of sharing is really important. Yes, this is working on the beat, sorry. This aspect of sharing is really important. So here I want you to consider the value of non-sectarian, non-specific, non-Christian narratives. Some Christians expect that all stories should explicitly give the gospel. If it's good, it has to give the gospel. But I think this is a problematic approach. Many of the recurrent moral motifs that we see in some of our most celebrated non-sectarian, non-specific narratives actually do align strikingly with the moral meta-narrative that we see in the biblical story of reality, if you look at it right away. This is a powerful point. It is also, of course, a potentially controversial one, especially for Christians who see Christ as always needing to stand in opposition to culture. Shared stories are a type of public education, but there is a difficulty in establishing a public education whenever there are a number of perspectives in the mix. Actually, in the history of moral education as public education in the U.S., it became apparent that the more sectarian a narrative became, the more divisive it necessarily becomes. So the conundrum is whether in our storytelling to be more or less specific, and both have drawbacks. The non-sectarian path is one of ambiguity and archetype. This is why Disney films never explicitly mention a Christian narrative, and why magic often stands in as a supernatural mediator, if you want to see it that way. And for some, that is not enough. However, non-sectarian stories are more likely to be shared across different sets of perspective and different people. The non-sectarian, someone asked a question last night about global sharings, the non-sectarian narratives that are more likely to have the global impact. And we said first. The sharing across different perspectives allows some avenue of common ground for Christians. We can use this to facilitate moral and theological dialogue. A sectarian narrative can be very specific. You can have a explicitly Christian story. So it can be specific morally or theologically, but because those lines are more explicitly drawn, they're less likely to be of interest to outsiders, especially if they use a language that outsiders don't know. There's an inaccessibility. And it's the apologist's task to show them that they ought to be interested. So the most effective dialogue usually seems to begin with some aspect of a shared culture or a shared story. I submit that in our own cultural context, the non-sectarian approach is arguably as inclusive as storytelling can be without necessarily facilitating the visual. This does not, of course, mean that all stories are equally worth engaging, and some stories may indeed, I guess I'm taking too long on this slide, but some stories may indeed be worth critiquing. There may be times that we ought to offer some criticism, but we don't have to grow anxious in a secular world as we see more and more secular stories. It doesn't mean we have no voice. And we certainly need not default to assault. Rather, we should approach stories as all as potential opportunities for apologetic dialogue. Now we reach one of the most powerful means of disseminating our ideas and imaginative concepts through the arts. The stories of pop culture are often written across an array of artistic expressions, and the arts often enhance our aesthetic impact. Film is especially potent as an aesthetic experience precisely because it's a coalescing of the visual with the musical with the practical storytelling, and is presented in a sort of organic artifact that you have to live through and experience. So powerful is this living through of aesthetic experience that some seek it spiritually. Charles Taylor observed a discernible shift, a historical shift, some of this was mentioned last night, from a pre-modern world enchanted with notions of a cosmic order and higher and material truths to our modern disenchanted world, which has left us haunted by our existential anxieties of disenchantment and desperate for some sense of fullness or meaning and purpose. Following the Enlightenment, he observes, we began to presume that significance is constructed by human beings. Yet our modern stories of significance have become curiously religious in nature, in a sense. And interestingly, the arts have become a new means of seeking transcendence. James Smith, also referenced last night, elaborates on this point. Conveniently, art is never going to ask you to do anything you wouldn't want to do. So we get significance without an aesthetic moral burden. The result is that many now seek aesthetic experience in itself for itself as an attempt to satisfy a lost longing for transcendence. In short, this creates a place to go for modern unbelief. And so we get these new sacred places of modernity, the concert hall as temple, the museum as chapel, and tourism as the new pilgrimage. Smith elsewhere argues that we often tie meaning to markets and habit to worship. In one place he says, human beings are not so much defined by what we know as we are by what we love, what we long for. We are what we love and we love what we worship. Elsewhere he says, we are lovers and our loves are shaped by our habitual practices. Because our hearts are primarily oriented by desire, by what we love, and because those desires are shaped and molded by the habit-forming practices in which we participate, it is the rituals and practices of the mall, the liturgies of the mall and market, which shape our imaginations and how we orient ourselves in the world. This is Black Friday, by the way. You can consider our rituals of Black Friday, or even our Super Bowl liturgies. So, pop culture and the arts are significant because first, ideas impact culture, and cultural narratives influence social imagining, how we invent together. Second, value education happens almost everywhere, but it happens to a significant degree through the marketplace. We often buy the things that form and shape our value and identities. Third, the arts are often expressions of worldview, or at least worldview questions, as they are embodied and lived out. As we consume that which provides us with a cathartic means of voicing our dissatisfactions with the human condition, or momentarily catching a glimpse of something that we long to experience, we consume the worldview, and with it, perhaps, the value prescriptions attached. Without wisdom and discernment, we might catch habit-forming ideas just like we catch a cold virus, without even realizing that we have it or where it has come from. Finally, there is something not to be missed in the fact that people look for significance to stories and the arts. We consume as meaningful those things which we believe at some level to possess meaningful references. C.S. Lewis once quipped, "Most dogs cannot understand pointing. You point to a bit of food on the floor unless they've been trained by one as a condition. You point to a bit of food on the floor, the dog, instead of looking at the floor, sniffs your finger. The finger is just a finger to him. His world is all fact and no meaning. But pointing means something to us. And stories and the arts in which they are embedded do just that. They point at some level, beyond the immediate experience, beyond the story itself, to something meaningful, or at least to questions of meaning." Now, I don't have time to unpack my philosophy of aesthetics, but let me briefly observe what I think some folks miss. Many apologists look to beauty as the object, the theme for which we long, and I think that there's something there, but I think that this misses two important points. First, deeper than our search for beauty, there seems to be a passion to know order. So I see the arts as a desire to know the meaningfulness of an order, a grand order. Second, we were made in the image of a maker to know and make meaningful things. And our stories and the arts signify something meaningful about the human experience. Even when it might not be called beautiful, it may, an art object, may yet reflect the beauty of the image of God in the person who is created. They're still making something, giving us something to think about. Some art objects are statements. Others are questions of exploration and explorations of meaning. And some may even function as existential sounding boards. So I see the stories, many stories and the arts often functioning as thought experiments, so common to the philosophy classroom. Or as philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff has called, world projections. I think that's a fitting image. We're makers of worlds. We're made in the image of a maker to make meaningful worlds. And so we recognize order and we have a passion to know it. We cannot help but seek it out in our stories, in the arts, in communion with others, as on Super Bowl Sunday, or by seeking identity in the things that we consume in the marketplace. In light of these considerations, I submit that a powerful cultural apologetics pivots from two foundational lenses or presumptions. These are the ones I tend to take anyway. And both of these are modeled in the approach of C.S. Lewis. First, human beings share a universal conviction concerning the fact of justice. And this is one of those questions where we talk about universals and universal truths. We often differ, for sure. But moral differences often come down to differences of non-moral beliefs on the things on which we differ, coupled with moral principles on which we do actually agree. Now, formalized moral arguments are indeed powerful, and there's times when we should go there. If objective moral principles exist, then God exists. P so Q. Or the inverse. If God does not exist, then nothing truly evil or unjust. Nothing is truly evil or unjust. Our experience testifies the latter is false, so the former seems unlikely. This is the modus ponens and modus tollens, if you know the philosophical language. So, what this shows is that it does seem to be the case that God and morality rise and fall together. So the formalized arguments are powerful. But I think the more significant move when it comes to moral apologetics is not the formalized argument, but the observation that there's something going on in our existential convictions. We all believe in the fact of justice. We all long for an end to evil and injustice. And here's the thing, in the question about subjectivity, objectivity, it only takes one universal to refute the claim that there are no universals, that there is no objectivity. Louis Pointman was a philosopher especially known for his moral philosophy. He describes a tribe in Sudan that throws their deformed children to the hippo, which they believe to be the god of the river. And then he notes that we differ with them in the non-moral belief that the hippo is the god and that deformed children are the hippo's property. But then he says something really interesting. He says we agree with them in moral principle. Why would he say that? That seems like so far from our moral convictions. Right? Why would he say anything like that? It's because we agree on a standard principle of justice. We ought to give what is due to whom it is due. In ethics, we disagree on what is due. We disagree on to whom it is due. But we agree that justice involves someone getting their due. That's a universal. Human beings share a deep conviction that there is a way it ought to be, a way things should go. So that's the first lens that I wrote, that human beings share a universal conviction. The second is that stories and aesthetic experiences possess a pronounced power to go deeper than our propositions and to stir our moral convictions and awaken our hope for finding significance and identity. The cultural apologist recognizes that aesthetic allure and the enchantment of a good story is attached to a deep desire for meaning. While C.S. Lewis was renowned for his propositional defenses of Christianity, for example, earlier in his life, and for example, in Mere Christianity, you get the propositional stuff. Later in his life, he turned more towards narrative apologetics, using stories. And if you know anything about his life, the romantic concept of Sehnsucht, this was something that would appeal to many romantics and him as well, this notion of a deep yearning for something that you never can seem to grasp. This played an important role in his own spiritual development and salvation, and also in his approach to a more imaginative apologetics. So there's something about the arts and this nagging desire that we have. Arguments from intuitive experience can carry existential and pragmatic force that is difficult to ignore. And it's a force that propositions don't necessarily have. Sometimes people just want the propositions, but the force is what reaches us in our living out. We live with deep convictions concerning goodness and justice, evil and injustice. This approach, I think, allows the cultural apologist to press into an appeal the appeal to human longing, a desperation for significance, and a hunger for hope in the face of a human condition. All right. So with the time that I have left, I just want to, because I know if it's all the heady stuff and the practical stuff, sometimes you want something you can take with you. Whether you can take this one out, I don't know. Your ability to share and communicate will be in part determined by the stories you share, right? So I at least want to share some approaches to the arts that I found helpful. Now, the arts do lend themselves well to arguments from beauty and arguments from desire and human significance. And that's a fruitful approach. So if you're not familiar with that and you want to look more into arguments from beauty and desire, those are important things. I encourage you to do that. But our focus today is on really the sharing of stories. So
Judy Lou.
Our goal is to unpack human expressions which resonate with something we feel and understand about our shared human experience. So first, because I'm not going right to the literature, don't forget that, so I'm a music guy, right? So don't forget that visual and musical, and even dance, the non-visual stuff, there's still storytelling. You don't have to just go to the literature to find stories.
Yeah.
When it comes to musical storytelling, there's much to consider, but focusing on lyrical content alone, most songs tell stories. Well, I don't have volume. Okay, well, this may not work.
Something's wrong with our eyes. Things in a different way. God knows it ain't good. It sure ain't no surprise. We need it on the own.
So that was supposed to have a little more dramatic effect. So most songs do, again, there's much more to music than just lyrical. But when we consider lyrics, there's plenty to unpack there. And most songs with lyrics tell stories, or they at least point to something good or troubling about the story. So we can use songs to unpack ethical issues, theological questions, or expressions of the human condition, hope, loss, goodness of relationships, the tragedy of estrangement, or even the fact, even if you don't know what it is, that there's something wrong with the world today. We can also use images. Am I getting this one? Yeah, sorry. We can also use images. Memes, of course, are notorious for problematic oversimplifications when presenting your work. Right? But they're popular precisely because the quick and the visual seems to resonate with the attention span of many consumers these days. But you can use this to your advantage. There is a simple value of humor. And even in the shock of something not as it should be, or maybe like this. He's got a blowtorch in his hand, by the way. Something doesn't fit him. Right. Or even there's value in the immediate power of recognition. This allows an image to gain attention more easily, and whatever you have to say immediately becomes more accessible. Right? So you can use a single image or a series of an image to communicate clear ideas or to start a dialogue. I often use some of these images from Disney in my some of my not moral theology, but just my ethics class to unpack certain things that are going on. For example, with virtue ethics. As demonstrated at the beginning of this presentation, remember we began with an image, you can draw out and unpack concepts which might be embedded in an image, or you can press further into a particular story that might be associated with that image, or you can use those problematic means to unpack. Yeah, they're often problematic, but use them. Let's unpack this idea, right? For the apologist, it gives you a teaching point, a place of entry into a bad idea. With film, you can often easily find and press into deep philosophical issues and tie them to questions of ethics and theology. For example, the culture, and this is perfect given our conversation we just had, the culture is currently fascinated with this idea of a multiverse. Well, guess what? That's the same language of the modal logic, which is the logic of the ontological argument for God's existence. Moreover, he started to press into this earlier, a multiverse still has to deal with the problem of a cosmological explanation and a teleological explanation. So the big three arguments are right there. Ontological, cosmological, teleological arguments are where a lot of people start apologetics. And knowledge of all possible worlds also ties into questions for the philosophers in the room of God's sovereignty and human free will. Finally, there are three distinctive approaches. If you didn't know, we have he did mention it, but we have a book on the book table for sale, Disney and Apologetics. Not just mine, I have some other contributing authors in there as well, so a lot to think about. But there are three distinct approaches taken in that work. First, we can examine a particular story to unpack a particular issue, moral, theological. Sometimes a particular story will allow us to use particular examples or to draw out theological symbolism. In Frozen, Elsa embraces moral relativism. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. She throws truth to the wind. It is good for her to let go of the bondage of self-imposed guilt, right? But the audience clearly sees that throwing truth to the wind doesn't work out for her. And actually, if you watch Frozen 2, she sees that herself, as she cringes when she sees this memory from an earlier time. I use a lot of Disney examples. Riot and the Last Dragon, also Disney film, portrays human estrangement as a curse resulting from human pride. That sounds familiar. Moana presents the human condition as a curse resulting from an injustice against an original right order, right? Marvel Comics' Venom serves as a fascinating study on sin, as Eddie must live with two warring natures, an alien skin and his own desires and will. Cinderella is an exploration in the problem of pain. there are other examples. A second approach, this is my personal favorite in the Disney work, I think what best represents my approach here overall anyway. You can unpack themes or motifs recurrent across several stories or art objects. So here you're taking a collection of narratives or art objects and you're pressing into a greater meta-narrative which seems to show itself the more you look. If you're taking, for example with Disney, if you're considering a single storyteller, then you can think of this as the more you look at the stories, their worldview coming into focus. Something that's really important to them coming into view. If you're looking across different storytellers or different art objects, then you can think of this more as revealing something about the human subconscious and our collective convictions, which our convictions of the way it should be and things that are wrong showing themselves the more we look. In my own work with Disney, I press into the fact that many Disney films are really interested in this notion of virtue ethics, that character is key to moral formation. And they're really interested in this kingdom ever after, right? You get a lot of emphasis on kingdom and the ever after good life is somehow involving the kingdom set right. Finally, you can use stories this one's a little tougher, but you can use stories to mediate a cultural tension by highlighting points of shared conviction that we see in the stories and pressing into how the Christian story of reality unfolds what appears to be most meaningful about the story. Stories appeal to our sensibilities, often asking us to consider other perspectives, to see things differently. That's a fair point. But stories often also expose our deeper convictions that there is a way things should be. So we can use stories to affirm our agreements, explore our disagreements, and explain our convictions. Thank you. How we look on time? Get 7 minutes or something?
Yeah, we got a few minutes for questions if anyone has any for Dr. Scarbrough.
We don't need a microphone.
No, I don't know if there's one up there.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry. You mentioned Christ being against the culture, then Christ being above the culture. What do you think of the idea that Christ redeems the culture?
Well, when you offer that lens, can you say a little more about what you mean by that?
Well,
Because I would say I agree. Christ can redeem culture.
but we should work towards, instead of just looking at culture and saying that how can we take advantage of this to use in apologetics, right? We should also work to, try to change the negative aspects of culture, right?
So I guess the philosopher in me is there's so many ways to approach that question. One thing is we can't change. We can't redeem anything.
Yeah.
Right? Christ redeems through us. And other senses, if you stress so much your job in changing, I think you might find a lot of frustration. That does not mean you can't influence positively, right? So I think that I wouldn't say that we change culture, but that in any of our interactions that we have, we do, as I said, kind of like with gardening, we do our best to plant seeds of wisdom here and there. And if we're doing that in all of our conversations, then Christ can redeem things through us. I also keep a little bit, I don't know if you would call this a skeptical answer or not, but the part of me that's very, that knows the biblical story, knows, I think sometimes, especially now in the political climate, we're like, where is this going? I think that it's easy for us to think that we can kind of maintain this kind of we've got it good and then Jesus comes back. But when I read Revelation, it sounds like things don't stay so great, right? So I don't know to what extent things will just change, but that doesn't mean we can't influence those that he's after.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes.
I think Christian thinkers and creators have done a great job of creating alternatives in the media. I go to every movie that has a positive slant and a positive message towards Christ to support that financially. On a personal level, I have a picture in my mind at a church we went to where an older fella walked up front with a skater. The skater kid, 13 years old, has a shaved head on this side, long hair on this side. And the story went that this kid told of this older gentleman coming over to the skate park. and started befriending some of these kids, like totally different cultures. Led a couple of them to the Lord, and then was this kid's testimony. The 13-year-old kid kept his culture, but this warrior of an older fella crossed into that culture to lead a kid to the Lord. And the kid started a Bible study with this guy of other skaters. And I thought, if we want to live courageously and really love people, we have to, and I tend not to, I isolate people that I don't like to see in an alternative culture. But the warriors will go in there and make a difference.
I like the way that you put that, kept his culture. Now, be careful here. There may be times that the subculture we're part of, we have to live behind when we're saved, right? But there may be times that you talk about the way I look or the where I skate park, you know. And so in those cases, I think that had he been like, well, now I need to dress like the Christians that I see at the church, you know, so we're back again. And so he would have lost his goal. He would have lost his impact with that group, I think. Maybe if he had suddenly stopped looking like them. So I think that's part of that sharing. Again, we read culture in different ways. It's not just the literature.
Well, and personally, I don't know you, but you're a perfect example of that. Wearing a three-piece suit and having the hair and the tattoos, you look like a man that could meet anybody and connect with them, which is a beautiful representation.
Well,
And you're brilliant, too.
full disclosure, when I'm not teaching, I am very dressed down. T-shirt.
Did I read that you helped write some of the comic books or give ideas for comic books?
I, at a younger point in my life, when I wanted to be a comic book artist, I would love that. But no, what I did was, so there's different, some are related to theological circles and some are not secular publishing scenes. But there are book series out there, different ones from different publishers that focus on pop culture and philosophy, or pop culture and theology, or things like this. And so what you're referring to is I wrote a chapter on Venom. That was for a series on pop culture and theology.
Oh,
And I also, just a shameless plug here for video game nerds, and I have a chapter coming up on Zelda and philosophy. Pretty nerdy.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the story is kind of a central canon in a lot of these discussions, and I was wondering, you know, for the folks that might not be the best storytellers, but realize that there's so much empowerment in trying to create a narrative so you can increase your communication, so you can evangelize in a really way. Could you possibly illustrate a resource for some of those folks that want to learn to become better storytellers?
So my first reaction is that I don't. That's a great thing. The artist in me is like, become a better artist, but I don't want you to feel like you have. There's not necessarily a pressure to be a better storyteller to do this. You have to be someone who enjoys stories right along with the next guy. And you're like, hey man, you hear that? Look at that. Why do you think Cinderella is like enduring that? And her theme, especially if you watch the live action, is like, you know, be kind, have courage, and be kind. What drives her to? Why shouldn't she pay back evil with evil? What's driving her? So I think it's more like coming alongside people and just diving in the story with them, not having to tell it. Your question, though, was about where to go for the resources for storytelling. I'm not sure if I have the best answer for that. I kind of come through it in a number of ways myself. As far as it relates to apologetics, Dr. Gold last night mentioned Alistair McGrath's. I love Alistair McGrath's work, but he has a work called Narrative Apologetics. And that does a good example of kind of talking more about this kind of stuff, how storytelling and apologetics comes together, but it's not necessarily going to make you a better storyteller. So when you ask that kind of question, this is a totally different problem that the church has. I think I was speaking with someone about it last night. We were talking about music because sometimes the church is like, a good musician is the church musician. And so I've experienced at least that some Christians have trouble acknowledging when they encounter music that is even where it might be in some places far away from Christian teaching. They have trouble saying anything nice about it. And I would think that there's still a quality in musicianship, because sometimes you can say, I don't like your message, but man, you're great at what you do. So to answer your question, it may be that you get good advice on how to be a better storyteller from someone who's not a Christian. So I would just say, I don't know, it's just, again, I don't have the best answer for this, but my impulse is find a good storyteller and ask them. Or if they're a writer, like read them. YouTube videos.
I was wondering, so I see you work at a college. I was wondering, so you spend time with Gen Z, of those approaches, like memes or, the arguments, which one have you seen be most receptive to Gen Z? Because I personally think that they're a lot more hungry for morality and ethics than sometimes we perceive them.
So I teach at a secular college, so I don't go into all this stuff a lot. But I do regularly in my ethics class use song and images. Because it's a quick and easy thing. If I want to talk about character building, I can show that a picture of beasts with the birds. I'm like, okay, this is in the song called There's Something There That Wasn't There Before. But he's a beast. What's there? What's changing? And so we can go into that story. So that helps me. Or Pinocchio with a line like, is Pinocchio about like, don't lie, like follow the rule? Or is there something else going on that is supposed to become? So the image is helping a lot. And then storytelling, I will often kind of use to unpack. Sometimes I just kind of expound on something I've already presented. Sometimes I'll use it as a thought experiment of sorts. I actually use Reba McEntire's Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. When we're talking about kind of making decisions for the greater good and our witness to that and death penalty. And so this is the story of someone wrongfully convicted and killed. And so I kind of hang them on the question, rephrase the question that's presented in the song. And I kind of give them a fake trial. I'm like, here are the facts. Is this person guilty? Okay. And most of them vote they're guilty and say, okay, should we give them the death penalty or not? And this happened. And say, okay, well, let's see what happened in the story. Right? So things like that. Any other? I think I'm over my time. I'll stick around if you have another question. But thank you for your time.